So today is the second Sunday after Easter. It is one of those Sundays for which the pericope or the readings are exactly the same every single year. And I can't exactly explain why, but I know what they do for me. The reading that we had just now from the Gospel of John is one that informs my own kind of belief, my own sense of understanding the story of Jesus as it works in my life. And that is because it's framed around this guy Thomas, who was one of the 12, right? The beloved Thomas, not the beloved disciple. You don't want to make that mistake, but Thomas, who's often known as Doubting Thomas. Right. And I've made the case 5 out of the now 8 years that I've been here that Thomas shouldn't be known as Doubting Thomas, but Thomas the Faithful. Why? Because Thomas is unwilling to take other people's word for the truth of the reality of Jesus' resurrection, right? He's unwilling to just take his brother disciples' word for it because he wants to have an experience of the risen Jesus for himself. That's what I believe. Now, he's not with the disciples when Jesus comes the first time. So where is he? Right? I mean, it's a very logical question. Where is Thomas? Why isn't he included? There's only one other disciple that isn't included in the upper room with all the doors locked and the window shades drawn, and that is Judas, and we know why, right? It's a whole other sermon or series of sermons. But he's the only one that's not present. So what are we supposed to make of that? He missed the party. Or maybe not. So we don't know exactly why Thomas isn't there. We don't know what he's up to. But what I can imagine, for me, is that Thomas isn't locked for fear of persecution or ending up with the same fate as Jesus, locked in the upper room. The same upper room, by the way, where the 3 nights before they had celebrated the Last Supper or the Passover, right, of the Lamb, and Jesus had washed their feet and given them communion or given them instruction on how to remember him in the future when he goes away. The very same room, they've locked the doors, they're hiding for their lives, and I don't blame them. I mean, who am I to blame or judge them? But Thomas is not with them. And in my imagination, it's because Thomas, the faithful, is the one who's like, you know what? Things have gone sideways. Some people are getting out of Dodge, right? That's the road to Emmaus, and the 2 disciples that are on the road to Emmaus and getting out of Dodge and going home with their tails between their legs. Some of you are hiding in the upper room with the locked doors, and you want to, for fear of your lives. But that's not the courageous, bold way of Jesus. That's not who he taught us to be. He taught us to be people who are love-spreading difference makers. He taught us to put it all on the line, just like he did, by his own example. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put it all on the line. Not just going out into the streets and being recognized as one of Jesus' disciples. That's enough putting it on the line, right? That's really risking his life. But he puts it all on the line so that I believe he can continue to do the work that Jesus called him to do. Healing the sick, serving the poor, healing, loving, reconciling. He's following in his rabbi's footsteps. Jesus never hid. Jesus never locked the doors. Jesus never drew the curtains for fear of his life. He always faced it. He always went where the trouble was. So, for example, at one point, Jesus hears that one of his best friends, Lazarus, is deathly ill, and his sisters send for him to come and heal him. And Jesus says, you know what? I'm going to go and heal him, which means it would take him back to Bethany, which is right into the center of danger, because the religious authorities were trying to kill him. And everybody knew it. So for him to go back to Bethany was really taking his life into his own hands, and it was dangerous. And the disciple says, no way. Peter's like, no, we're not going there. You're not going to go there. This is what they'll do to you. But it's Thomas who stands up and says, you know what? I'm with him. I'm with Jesus. If he goes, let us go also and die with him. It doesn't sound like a doubting, unfaithful dude. He doesn't exactly understand his belief. I'll give him that. But he knows that Jesus is the one to follow. He believes that Jesus is something that he says that he is. He believes that Jesus is the Son of God. And he's willing to go there with him when the other disciples are not. So I think that Thomas is a faithful guy because he's willing to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. If you were here last week, in one of my homilies, I think it was the vigil, the whole point was follow Christ. Follow him and do as he does. And that's what I think Thomas is doing. He's following Jesus. He's doing as Jesus does. Now, I don't mean to put down the other disciples, because I would probably be hiding myself. They were scary times. But you and I need to remember that this whole thing that we do on Sunday mornings, it's not about taking somebody else's word for it, right? It's not just about saying, okay, I'm going to take the Bible's word for it, or I'm going to take Statia's word for it, or I'm going to take Paul's word for it, or I'm going to take Father George's word for it. Yeah, okay, that's what I believe. That is not what it means to follow the risen Christ. Now, we can be religious people all day long, and we can profess what we believe, but if we have not loving action behind it, then it's like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And what good is that? So we are called to follow Jesus. And close behind Jesus, I think, is Thomas, who is doing as Jesus does and calling each one of us out to say, you know what? It's not enough to have my brothers and sisters' word for it. I want to experience the living Christ in my own life. Somebody said at the Adult Christian Formation this morning that it needs to be two things. It needs to be practical. Following Jesus needs to be practical. It has to be able to be applied to our lives in practical ways. And it has to be transformational. It has to be practical and transformational. And I think that that's what Jesus is calling us to. Is to go and love as Jesus loved. To go and serve as Jesus served. To go and die to ourselves as Jesus died. To himself, not his will, but the will of the Father. To go and do as love does. That's our work. And here we are in the second Sunday after Easter, and we have 50 days during this Eastertide season to practically apply the following of Jesus. Now, how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, we take him at his word. He says, love one another as I have loved you. That's hard work. That's hard work. But it is the work that we're called to. So over the next 50 days or 40 some odd days that we have left of Eastertide, we're going to look at, in the preaching and in the teaching that we have around here, about how we can practically apply that directive to love one another as Jesus loved us, as he demonstrated for us on the cross, as he demonstrated for us at the foot washing, as he demonstrates for us in the Eucharist that we celebrate. We're going to look for practical and transformative ways of loving one another, because that is the same as loving God. To love one another, to follow Jesus and his instruction, is to love God. So we're going to look at that. Does that sound like a plan? Does that sound like a plan? Yes. Okay, I just want to make sure everybody's tracking here.